What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Zoria, Age of Shattering, a TRPG with some CRPG elements that sees us upgrading and maintaining a keep full of all sorts of recruits and soldiers as we seek to stave off the impending invasion of enemy forces against our home kingdom. But before we jump into all of that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything I cover, there's a link to a video posted in the description below, and my Steam profile is linked below and public as well. As I mentioned, Zoria is primarily a TRPG, but it does have elements from other games, and it's trying to do a lot of things. We're going to be upgrading and maintaining a keep, which includes a roster of potential companions. When they're not exploring the world with you, you can send them on missions. There's a full-blown crafting system, quite a few different classes, each with their own benefits that they can bring to exploration even. And for all of those systems, it is important to remember that this is a relatively dense indie adventure. So this game is like $25 full price. It's on sale right now for the spring sale for 10% off, but normally $25. And the developer, I believe, is made up of just 3 people. Now, to kick this thing off properly, let's talk about the technical state of the game. Overall, I would say it's not terrible, but there's definitely some room for improvement, though it is worth a mention right at the beginning of this section that since the game's release late last week, they've already released a couple of patches for it. They've been very quick in that regard, and they've already addressed a few things I've run into and are actively looking to fix more. So the technical state of this one is improving pretty quickly. But in particular, I ran into a few things like some typos, some spelling errors here and there, some odd pathing on occasion, characters getting stuck on things. A couple of quests can be a little touchy if you don't complete them in the right manner, though they got on top of the ones I ran into for that pretty quickly. But for me, the game never crashed or anything, and really what I ran into was just a lot of small stuff, which might get annoying over the course of the playthrough, but is hardly game-breaking or anything. Now, I did read a few Steam reviews for this game that mentioned it crashing pretty frequently for some people, but hard to say why. So while you might run into a major issue potentially, most people seem to not, and really just run into smaller things like myself. Moving right along to the difficulty section though. So, one of the things you'll pick right at the beginning of the game is the game's difficulty, which ranges from easy, normal, hard, and unfair. Now, what is supposed to change here is that enemy stats go up, they deal more damage, etc., and their AI is supposed to change a little bit as it goes up to target specific classes that you might be using, etc. Now, in practice, and I don't know if this was a bug or not, I could not really notice a material difference between any of these difficulties. I tested all of them out. You can change them on the fly, so that's pretty easy to do. And I even tried moving from one area to the next to see if it was a reload issue. And none of these difficulties changed anything that I was aware of. All enemies seem to have the same amount of health, deal roughly the same amount of damage. And on every difficulty you put the game on, they always seem to go after caster classes first if they can easily kill them. And again, I'm not sure if this was a just very persistent bug I was running into or what, but none of these difficulties felt different at all to me, which was honestly pretty odd. Now, right before you pick the difficulty, however, we have character creation, where you primarily have a class choice and then your cosmetic character creation, though the graphics here aren't exactly stellar, so cosmetic character creation is a little on the basic side with you choosing a general hairstyle, color, that kind of thing. With the more important choice, of course, being your class. You can pick from a handful of different classes, though notably not all of them, but as this is a party-based game, you'll get to play with even something like the Necromancer, which you can't pick here. The important thing to note, though, is that every class has a trait ability and a resting bonus. Your trait ability is your exploration or combat ability. This is something that class can do while they are in your party running around the open world with you, or open maps, I should say. The resting bonus is a potential bonus for when you rest, provided that you rest long enough, that provides some convenient benefit. And again, seeing as you're going to be partying with several members of every class, there's no right choice here, just pick the one you want. It's just important to understand what they do. And that brings us to the story side of the game. The story of Zoria is pretty standard fantasy fare. I wouldn't say it's going to blow you away or anything, but I don't think it's bad either. Essentially, the last 10 years or so, two warring nations, the Isrians and Ilion, I think it is, have fought pretty much to a stalemate after the Isrians have been going around conquering territory left and right. However, in the last couple of years, the Isrians have finally started to turn the tide in their favor via the use of necromancy, which has pushed our kingdom and our main character, the commander of a force, to just a few strongholds left, and the game actually opens with us fleeing from a recently fallen one. From here, our goal is pretty simple: to regroup what forces we can, build up a keep to form a defense against the onslaught of continuing aggression from the Isrians, while also seeking to put a stop to it in some way, which is a pretty tall order, and I won't say more than that for the sake of spoilers, but managing all that and upgrading your keep plays a huge role in the game. Beyond just that setup, I do think there's a couple of neat twists that come throughout the game, and there's even a few choices you'll get to make later on, which can lead to one of 3 different endings, though you'll primarily decide that right at the end. There are a few moments where you can choose between one or another path, and that can lock you off from a little bit of content, though it is not as deep as a more traditional CRPG. So there's some minor choice and consequence to be had, and the story is decently engaging. It is partially voice acted, not the entire thing, but the most important stuff is voice acted. I know that's important for people, so I wanted to mention it. And from there, we can talk progression systems. So, we're primarily going to be talking character progression as things like progressing your keep, we'll talk about in the gameplay section, but progression for our characters that we'll be picking up comes down to your levels, stats, skills, and gear. As you explore with your characters, engage in combat, take on quests, you'll be leveling up, which means we are going to be earning attribute points and skill points. Now, attribute points we can disperse as we see fit, though this is primarily going to be based on your class. You're going to get 5 per level, and for the most part, you just want to see what your class's skills happen to be scaling off of and pump that stat. So like a wizard uses intellect for basically everything, so that's what you want there. And then you might want to put a little bit into stamina for some extra health, but you can always buff your stats here through the Diablo-esque loot system as well, so it's not exactly make or break. Now, on the skill point side of things, every single class has this skill tree. As you level up at certain levels, you'll gain skill points that you can then learn new abilities with. You cannot get every skill on the skill tree, but you can reset it and pick things as you please, provided you're not actively in combat, of course. And because of this, every class can kind of specialize in a general gameplay style and pick certain skills over the others. The best thing to do here is, of course, just play around and find what you like. I will say that Wizard did consistently the most damage compared to anything else for me, with the caveat to that being that they were a bit of a glass cannon. A simple enough skill system though, so not too much more to say really. Now the other part of progression is gear. The game features what I would consider a Diablo-esque loot system that sees you constantly picking up drops from both enemies you kill, items from around the world you can break open will drop potentially gear as well. You'll get them as quest rewards. So you're going to be absolutely loaded down with gear, which actually creates a bit of a inventory problem, but we'll get to that. Now, gear is pretty straightforward, but the main thing to know is which stats you want to put on your character, because there's all sorts of modifiers and things that can roll on them, and basically you don't want to be putting stats onto a character that's not benefiting from them. All of it does, however, have a level associated with it, which can help you pick your gear, just simply based on the actual rarity tier plus what level it is. A really cool thing, though, is that a little bit later in the game, you can actually find class-specific gear, which is a little more set in stone and offers specific bonuses to certain classes. Later on, you can actually craft some of this, which is pretty handy, but otherwise, it's all randomly generated. Worth a mention, though, that towards the end, you're going to be managing something like 20, 30 people. I didn't actually count how many it was, but it's a lot of people you'll have in your party, so you might want to hold on to some of this gear to outfit your entire roster if you want to switch them out a lot, and you can store everything in a storage crate once you get your keep, so it doesn't get too crazy. But nonetheless, gear plays a huge role in progression, which brings us to the gameplay section. By far the most going on, because Zoria is a game trying to do a lot of things, though I wanted to say this here because I didn't know where else to put it. The opening area of this game I don't think is particularly well done. you start the game being attacked by Isrians as they are just about to capture the keep or fort where you were at, and you need to escape back to the capital to sort of reassess and restart what you're trying to do here. So the tutorial is essentially you running away from the enemy army. And the problem here is that it's not a particularly balanced experience. I really didn't like this tutorial. Once you get out of it though, the game gets a bit easier and it's a better, I would say, learning curve as you're trying to figure everything out. And I say this because the enemies that you're fighting in the tutorial will do things like use attacks that sunder your armor, which is to say they reduce your armor's ability to protect you, which means you start taking more damage. Sunder can only be fixed by a Lancer companion or going back to the merchant to have it repaired, and that is on top of a regular durability mechanic where items will be breaking down as you use them, which gets tedious pretty quickly. And then you will also be trying to figure out the resting mechanic, which sees you utilizing very limited supplies in the tutorial to heal up and potentially have a Lancer restore some of your gear as it gets broken. And that's to say nothing of the boss fight for the end of the first area, which is like weirdly difficult for a tutorial boss. And then after you get out of that, suddenly the game gets a ton easier for some reason, where now you're just fighting like goblins who don't have the abilities I just mentioned. And then shortly after that, you wind up getting your keep and you can start upgrading it. And it's a much smoother experience after you get out of the intro, which feels a little bit backwards. But structurally speaking, this game is divided up into a bunch of different chapters. Now, after we get out of the opening, but also in the opening, you are free to explore these sort of open maps that you find yourself in and tackle quests as you encounter them at your own pace and in mostly any order you want outside of the main quest, of course. Now, exploration-wise, there's a decent amount to do. You can run around, find all sorts of crafting ingredients in the form of plants, minerals, etc. There's even a sort of area loot button hotkeyed for you, which is nice because you're going to be picking up a ton of stuff. And there's even some interactive elements in the exploration via your class abilities and things like boom barrels, which are effectively things that allow you to blow up walls to access certain areas occasionally, alongside the relatively limited environmental puzzles which sometimes happen. Now, the class abilities use things like, say, a Lancer to break through certain walls, or a Kingsman to bypass mechanical switches, or a Wizard to conjure a path where there is none, or a Thief to disarm traps. And the list goes on. So exactly who is in your 4-person party at max is important because they need to do certain things for you. Very recently, they patched the game to actually show certain dungeons recommending classes, as those dungeons have the associated class ability that you'll need. But as you're doing all of that, you're going to be running into a variety of what I like to call entropy mechanics, things that break down your effectiveness over time. This is things like durability, the Sunder mechanic I mentioned. There's other things like poison stacks that can reduce your, I believe it's initiative or chance to hit. But after combat, your characters will also be stacking up fatigue, which ruins their stats as they get more and more tired, all of which you'll need to be managing as you go. And once you get used to it, it's not so bad, but there's frankly just way too many of them. I would reel this in a little bit, such as the Sunder armor or durability for your armor. Just pick one, I don't need to deal with Sunder armor reducing my effectiveness, but also durability breaking my items. It's really kind of an either-or situation in my opinion. But then we have things like fatigue. In order to clear fatigue, you need to rest. Now, you can rest out while you're exploring, which sees you setting up a little camp, at which point you can access your crafting via alchemy or cooking even to give yourself some extra rest bonuses. But to actually rest, you have to have a certain number of supplies per character. Now, the more or longer you want to rest in 2-hour increments, the higher that supply cost becomes. This isn't terribly limiting, and once you get a little ways into the game, it's not bad at all, but it can be something to keep an eye on towards the beginning, because if you don't have the ability to rest at an opportune moment, you might have a bad time. Now, when you rest, for every 2 hours you rest, you can activate one of your class resting bonuses, some of which can help you manage those entropy mechanics, like your Lancer reducing sundered armor, for instance. Though that brings us to the crafting system. The crafting system, in my opinion, is a good idea, but I think they need to work on the execution a little bit, because you will be picking up a metric ton of crafting materials and gear as you play this game, and your inventory inventory just isn't that large, frankly, and I never found a way to increase it, which means I'm constantly juggling materials, and I can't craft anything if I don't have those materials in my inventory as opposed to my keep's storage. So I think just a couple of small refinements would make this better, such as allowing you to craft with materials from your keep, or simply allowing crafting materials to not take up inventory space. Outside of that complaint, though, crafting works by gathering the appropriate recipes for whatever it is you happen to be trying to craft, such as potions, armor, weapons, etc., and then going to the crafting menu and applying the appropriate materials to each slot. Now, what you make a individual crafting recipe out of matters, because this is how you are going to determine the stats of the finished product for your gear anyway. And because of that, even set recipes are a little bit customizable based on what you use to actually make the piece with, as the crafting recipe will be calling for things like a metal or a piece of crystal or gem, and you get to decide what gem or crystal you use for that thing, for instance, which each has their own stats. So a decent enough crafting system that allows you to customize your gear. I think they just need to make a couple of refinements to really nail it, and then they'll be good to go. Now that brings us to the keep. So right at chapter 2, you'll be building up your keep, which is going to provide you all sorts of bonuses, materials, party members, etc. Your keep is broken down into a bunch of different subsections, which you can upgrade by paying supplies and gold and assigning people to research the upgrade. The researchers, though, have to be of a certain class, which is where your recruits come in. As you start upgrading your keep, you're going to be attracting all sorts of people looking to join your cause, which is where you get all of your other party members from. Each individual keep upgrade can offer specific companions that will join your party, and they will be of varying levels as well. This is going to give you the ability to customize your exact loadout for any given encounter or exploration in a pretty free-form manner, but no matter how you slice it, you're going to be left with a ton of party members doing nothing if you don't send them out on missions. Another thing you can do here is, from the mission table, send them out to take on little quests and bring back rewards, though if I'm being honest, I never found this particularly necessary to do, mostly just because I was getting so much stuff from everything else that the rewards from doing these missions just didn't really seem worth it outside of giving experience to party members I wasn't using anyway, so that was a bit of a miss for me. Now, a cool thing about upgrading your keep, though, is as you upgrade it, the space does actually physically change and you'll get access to new areas that were blocked off previously, which can oftentimes bring materials and gear that you can pick up, some of which is quite good. Though I will say, in a bit of a strange move, the best stuff you can get from the keep upgrades doesn't equate to the best stuff you can get, as your max level kind of goes beyond what the keep will upgrade to, which means there comes a point where those upgrades kind of stop being useful, which was a little bit of a bummer. Now, beyond everything I just mentioned there, I will say that chapter 2 is by far the biggest chapter. You're going to be running around the keep outskirts, if you will, doing all sorts of quests, setting things right, some optional, some required, some of which lead into longer quest chains where you'll investigate things, solve a couple puzzles even. And that is when I would say the game is at its best, because for every janky little system I just mentioned, it also just feels really good to be upgrading your keep, upgrading your characters who are leveling up the whole time, and you get kind of attached to these individual party members who can all chime in on certain events as you encounter them. And honestly, just the exploration and the world itself is fun to look at and move through. So while the systems aren't always balanced and need a bit of fine-tuning, I would say, the sense of exploration and moving through these areas still shines through for me. Which brings me to the combat section. So, combat in this game is pretty quick for turn-based combat. It is an action point system, primarily 2 action points, though there are certain abilities that can rob someone of an action point or, say, give someone an extra one. But you're going to spend those action points either on moving or activating abilities. Abilities are going to utilize your action points, either 1 or 2, your energy or your mana based on what class you're using. More martially focused classes use energy, whereas magic classes use mana. And then everyone uses focus. As you use your basic abilities, you'll earn focus, and then you can use that to activate your better abilities. Some classes also have just abilities that generate focus as well, though, so it's a sort of builder and spender system. Now, the thing that I didn't like about combat the most was just managing all of those debuffs I mentioned. Enemies are constantly hitting you with things like poisons, disease, sunder armor, which all has to be managed, typically either by using potions or resting in a certain way, and that's to say nothing of the fatigue mechanic, the durability mechanic. So, as I mentioned, I think there's just a fair few too many entropy mechanics to deal with, which can make combat a bit of a headache sometimes instead of enjoyable. Especially in a late game area where you're just slogging through a ton of combat without a chance to really rest or regroup or talk to a merchant even to sell all this junk you're getting. So there's like a 3 or 4 hour section towards the end where that was very apparent. But outside of that, combat can generally be quick and fun. Now, one, I would say, more major issue it has, though, is that it's very difficult to control what your enemies are doing movement-wise. A common thing with turn-based tactical games is that you want to focus on controlling what your enemy is going to do on their turn, via either the action economy or simply tactics, killing individual characters first, that kind of thing. But the problem with Zoria here that it has is that there's no sense of zone of control, if you will. Oftentimes enemies can walk right past you without triggering so much as an attack of opportunity to kill your mage in the back, and they're actually really good at doing that because they seem to be able to constantly outrange your party. For instance, their ranged characters, via things like bombs, bows and arrows, etc., always seem to have a much larger range than your characters do, which means on your turn, you're constantly trying to get into range. And then on the enemy's turn, they walk right past your melee guys to go smash up your back line with basically no consequences or recourse on your end, which I think is when combat is at its weakest. Now, in spite of that, there's still some fun stuff you can do with this. Again, I found the wizard really satisfying, but you can use things like the necromancer to summon up minions, or the night warden, which is like a sort of Van Helsing type using a rapier and a crossbow, and combining those with other classes and kind of using them to beneficially use all of their abilities in sync can be a good time, but it's still definitely rough around the edges. Once you get used to some of the peculiarities of it, though, due to how quick it's going and your use of the individual abilities you can learn and whatnot, you can have a decently fun time with combat, even if it never quite blows you away. Next up, let's talk about the Steam Deck for this game. Officially, it does not have a rating for the Steam Deck just yet, but I will say it is perfectly playable, but there are a few things to know. One, the game does not have official controller support. The default Steam layout works pretty well, but you might have to customize a few keys here and there to get it exactly the way you want it, and the game itself is only ever going to show you PC prompts. So there's going to be a little bit of memorization necessary on your end. Now, otherwise, controls for the game work fine. TRPGs generally work pretty well on the Steam Deck, so that's not a huge surprise there. And once you fiddle with the keys a bit, you can get it to a point where it feels pretty good to play, even with a controller. Now, the other thing, though, is the Steam clouds. I don't know if this was just a problem on my end or something, but I could not get the cloud saves to work, even though they are supported for the game. Every time the game tried to sync up with the cloud, and thus my Steam Deck, it would throw an error, and I wouldn't be able to get my save files from my PC to my Steam Deck for some reason. So, again, not sure if that was just like Steam or me specifically, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Otherwise, though, the game runs fine. It's not exactly a graphically demanding title, so I'd have been surprised if it had any issues there. And really, the controls are the main thing to know ahead of time that you'll have to adjust a little bit, which brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. Now, on the positive side of things, it's really fun to build up your keep, interact with your roster of characters, engage in some of the side content, and just running around and exploring was fun. And I think, in spite of the many janky systems, that really shines through. The core of what Zoria is trying to do is a fun concept, and you can tell that a lot of heart went into that part of the game. Now, for the negative side of things, it's just that the game has a lot of awkward, janky systems. There's so many systems that don't quite fit just right, or they can be a little redundant, like durability and sunder armor, or things like, for instance, a NPC telling you that here's some gold for completing this quest, but what they actually give you is like gear. There are certain balance issues with combat. For instance, the wizard only needs intellect, whereas other classes need things like strength, stamina, and agility to be effective, which means their stat spread is so thin it's harder to play them. There's a couple combat issues I mentioned, and all of that combined just makes me feel like this game really could have have used an early access period, because it's essentially an indie game, and I think it really would have benefited from some player feedback before its full 1.0 release. And while right now the devs are already patching the game very quickly, like I mentioned, and they're addressing a lot of these problems and being very responsive to feedback, just kind of reinforces that feeling to me that they probably should have went with an early access launch, even for just like 6 months, to have given them a chance to iron a lot of this stuff out. Which brings me to my conclusion. Zoria Age of Shattering is a game that was clearly made with a lot of passion, and that shines through in spite of a lot of awkward and janky moments, which I'm sure people are getting tired of hearing me say in this review by now. But despite those systems, the game is still fun to play. Like, I had a good time running through this. I actually played it substantially more than I thought I was going to, because once you learn how a lot of those systems work and what to do and how to deal with them, it can be fun just kind of playing around them. But realistically, I think this game should have gotten an early access period, and in most situations, I probably would have given this a buy on sale. However, I'm going to give Zoria here a buy because this game happens to have a saving grace in that regard that is really the best one that you could ask for, and that is that it's a cheap game. Full price, it's $25. It's already on sale for 10% off as part of the Steam Spring Sale at the moment of this review, for instance, though. And if I'm being honest, that's about what I would have been willing to pay for it. And I think it's pretty obvious to me the devs are committed to improving it as they go and responding to all this feedback. In light of all those things, it gets a buy from me simply because it's cheap, it's fun in spite of its problems, and I think if you go into it knowing what to expect, you can have a pretty good time for it. But that is pretty much going to do it for this review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.